The second part of this video, this is going to be talking about the growth of Rome as well as some of the characteristics of Roman society. So again, in the first video we talked about how the Etruscans were still in favor of monarchies. So in Rome proper they developed this republican form of government, and as they grew in strength they actually started to overthrow the Etruscan monarchies. So as time goes on, they start to encourage other Italian city-states to revolt against the Etruscans, and once they do this, the Romans start to conquer other city-states throughout the Italian peninsula, and once those city-states were free from Etruscan rule, they basically start to extend their own system of government, my apologies there, their own system of government throughout the entire Italian peninsula. So some of the keys to Roman success. First off, they had adept leaders and smoothly organized armies, and they also extended the privileges of the Roman Republic to conquered peoples. So as they started to expand throughout the Italian peninsula, anyone that they conquered, even if they were Etruscan, they would become citizens of Rome. So this is really significant, and this strategy allowed the Roman people to gradually conquer the entire Italian peninsula, which they successfully achieved by 264 BCE. Again, what we see is that the Romans, they move farther south, and eventually they start to come into conflict with the people who lived in the Greek colonies in southern Italy, so places like Sicily. There's going to be a series of wars that they engage in to try to conquer the former Greek people. These are 4 wars that take place between 218 and 148 BCE, and eventually the Romans were victorious. They defeat Macedonia, which, as you remember, that was the area north of Greece, so sort of, if you look at my cursor, right around here. But in addition to that, they conquer all of Alexander the Great's former empire. And then the Romans proceed to move even farther north, and they take Gaul, which is France today. And we're going to talk about Greece and Gaul more in... Actually, we can sort of use this map as a basis. What we're going to see is that if you look at this this map key here, that Rome by 275 BCE or so before these wars with the Greeks, it was just the Italian peninsula, so this area that's represented in yellow. And then after they come in conflict with the Greeks, this area in light yellow, we're going to see that they start to conquer basically all of the Iberian Peninsula, which is now Spain, parts of southern France, parts of northern Italy, even Austria, all of the former Greek Empire, even part of the Anatolian Peninsula. And then as time goes on, we haven't talked about the AD years yet, but what we're going to see is that they continue to expand so that they eventually take up all of the Mediterranean world. And what's important is that their next step is to go against northern Africa. And so they had their sights set on Carthage. Carthage was an ancient city on the north coast of Africa. We can see it here. This map is a little bit distorted. But it was very wealthy. It once belonged to the Phoenician Empire, but eventually it created its own empire by conquering parts of Spain. So we can see that the entire Carthaginian Empire was part of North Africa, as well as this southern and eastern part of Spain, the island of Sardinia and Corsica, and even part of Sicily. Rome wanted to be able to control Carthage because then they would have a monopoly over the Mediterranean trade, but the Carthaginians weren't just going to let Rome take over weren't just going to let them take over their empire without a fight. And so the fight between Rome and Carthage, there were 3 different wars, and they were known as the Punic Wars. So what we're going to see is that first off, these wars take place over a fairly considerable period of time, 264 to 146 BCE. The ruler of Carthage that emerges as a very powerful general was named Hannibal. Even though Hannibal was a very adept military leader, what we will see is that eventually the Carthaginians are defeated. In 146 BCE, at the end of the Third Punic War, the Romans capture Carthage, and then they destroy the city. They enslave the population, and according to legend, they then salted the land, which made it infertile, and this also was going to condemn Carthage to poverty for years to come. And so this is where we get the term Carthaginian peace. It's the idea that not only do you conquer a city or an empire, but you also destroy the entire thing afterwards. Now, what we will see eventually is that when the Romans start to settle in Carthage, they're going to rebuild it. But the general significance of the Roman victory in the Punic Wars is that now they have a monopoly over the Mediterranean trade network. So what we're going to see is that the victory over Carthage gives Rome control of a large empire. Their empire includes parts of North Africa, as we can see here. So this is all going to be conquered by Rome. They're going to have control over Spain, Sicily, and then what we're going to see again is that they rebuild Carthage later. They maintain a colony there. Carthage, after it's rebuilt, is going to become the fourth largest city in the Roman Empire. And then Roman armies are going to continue to conquer areas even farther east, which you can't quite see on this map, but places like modern Syria, Egypt, and then they even are going to expand north and west to places like England and also Germany by the middle of the 1st century in the Common Era. Now, the conquest of the Romans was not permanent. We know that eventually Rome is going to fall to outside peoples of mainly Germanic origin, but ultimately this is a very significant victory for its time, which does result in several centuries of Roman dominance over the Mediterranean era. So how do the Romans do it? What is it about their army that allows them so many victories? First off, we can make some comparisons between the Roman military and the Greek military. There was a requirement to serve, so all citizens between the ages of 17 and 46 who owned land had to serve in the Roman legion, and the legion was a word for their large army. Okay, so we can compare that to Sparta. Now, first off, Sparta we know was stricter in terms of its military leadership, so boys as young as 7 started to gain their military training in Sparta, and they continued to serve until they were 60. So ages 17 to 46 in the Roman legion is not as large of an age span, but still it's a pretty significant one. As the Roman Empire expanded, the armies were increasingly necessary, not only to continue to expand, but of course for them to protect the lands that they gained. Many of the soldiers came from a poor farming background, and so when they joined the army, many of them ended up selling off their land to wealthy patricians. So what the patricians did then is they would take all these lands that they bought from these poor farmers who joined the army, and they combined them into these huge estates, and they were called latifundia. We see one of these over here to the right. So we're going to talk about the consequences of that in just a moment. But this has significant ramifications for class structure in Rome. So some soldiers, after they did their service in the military, would settle elsewhere in the Roman Empire, but many of them actually went right back to Rome to live there. And what we're going to see then is that by the time of Julius Caesar, Rome's population was considerable. There were more than 1 million people in Rome and growing. So Roman society, we could again compare this to some of the ones we've already studied, like the Greeks and the Persians. They too had slaves, and not unlike the societies we've already studied, most of them were prisoners of war, they were foreigners, and they were brought back to Italy to work in homes and on large farms of wealthy Romans. So like the latifundias, again, is where many of the slaves worked. Because these latifundias, or large estates, continued to grow as more and more people joined the military, there was an increasing demand for slaves, but also because the Romans were conquering so much territory, that meant that there was a very sufficient number of slaves that were available. So what we're going to see is that, except in the poor families, most Roman children were actually educated and raised by slaves, and many of these slaves were actually Greek in background. So this shows us that there's still an important connection culturally between the Greeks and the Romans, even if the Greek society has declined. What we're going to see is that if Greek slaves are going to be raising Roman children, that they're going to be raising them to learn things like Greek mythology and philosophy. This is one of the major reasons why a lot of Roman literature, a lot of even Roman religion is similar to the Greeks. It's because they are learning the same ideas. So the Greek people, even though they were enslaved, were still very valuable to the Romans. So what we're going to see again is that as the conquests of ancient Rome increased, the number of captives that were available for slavery grew. And over time, the conditions for slaves are going to get worse. And one of the reasons why that happens is because there was a major slave rebellion in 73 BCE. It was called the Spartacus Rebellion because it was led by a slave named Spartacus. It was one of the largest slave revolts in history, and it was defeated by Roman soldiers. So once the Roman soldiers put down the rebellion, they ended up killing thousands of rebels. About 6,000 slaves were captured and executed by crucifixion, which is a very brutal way to be killed. And because it took them a while to die by crucifixion and their bodies were on display, it sort of served as a warning sign to other people thinking of rebelling not to do so. So what we see is that as the conditions of slavery worsen and as the numbers of slaves increase, it's actually going to be bad for Roman technology and innovation. Because slave labor was so cheap, landowners didn't have an incentive to develop new forms of technology to make agriculture easier, for example, because they could just have slaves do the work for them. So one could say that this is a negative repercussion of the growth of slavery in Rome. Now, another repercussion of the growth of slavery is that the small landowning class is going to increasingly decline. So because slave labor was so cheap, many small landowners lost out on economic opportunities. Again, as we said before, small landowners tended to join the military in large numbers. They were forced to. And when they joined the military, they had to sell off their property. Much of this property was sold to wealthy patricians. So what this meant was that not only did they lose land when they sold it, when they joined the military, if they kept their farms, they oftentimes could not compete with the production of slaves on large estates. So what we're going to see is that many small farmers end up losing their estates over time. Again, they have to sell off a lot of their land when they join the military, and over time, large estates are going to absorb more and more of small landowners' holdings, which contributes to the growth of the patrician class and the decline of the influence of the small landowning class. And then, of course, we can't forget Roman women. Again, we can definitely compare this to some of the other women in these Eurasian societies that we've already studied, like the Greeks and Persians. Again, this is a patriarchal society, so Roman women faced many forms of discrimination. They could not be citizens, only men could. They could not vote. If they were married, their husbands ended up owning all the family property, and their husbands also were the heads of the household. But one of the things that we did see is that if you were of a high social position, you could receive some level of education. So that is a significant element. Of course, it was limited only to the patrician class, but still significant that some Roman women actually did get raised by learning the classics, learning how to read. It showed that even if they were not actually able to be represented in the political body, that they still had an awareness of how the law worked. We do see that one of the actually, ironically, best situations for women is if they were widowed and their father was dead, because then they could inherit property and keep it. But say they remarried, all that property would then get passed on to their husband. So it was normally a temporary gain. So that's the end of the video on Roman expansion and society. We're going to continue. The next video is going to talk about how Rome evolves from a republic, which was smaller, to an empire, which is much greater in size and influence. So